Russia and China have been in each other's good graces in recent years, so it might be hard to believe they could be falling out. When the Ukraine war started, everyone assumed that Russia and China would be united forever because of their hatred for the West. But recently, cracks have started to emerge in this friendship. As the famous saying goes, in the game of geopolitics, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Today, we're going to dive deep into Sino-Russian relations very closely to shine a light on the cracks in the outward expression of friendship. Have you noticed that it's really difficult to find content like this on YouTube lately? Videos like this that discuss geopolitical matters, especially about China and Russia, tend to be drowned out by the YouTube algorithm because foreign bots downvote them to kill their reach. So, if you can, help us out by hitting the like button below. Share it on social media if you think this information's valuable. And now, let's get started. Before we get into the built-up tension between these two giants, let's go back to how relations between the two started. Russia and China were not always political buddies, and in the 60s, they did not see eye to eye. Both countries competed for control over foreign communist states and political movements, and many countries had two rival communist parties that concentrated their fire on each other. To further fuel dissension, in 1969, there was a brief border conflict known as the Sino-Soviet border conflict. It lasted 7 months, and though it was later resolved, it left a bitter taste in the mouths of both nations. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was humbled and began to play nice with everybody else. Under its conciliatory policy, they finally put the border dispute to rest and began to pursue a partnership in the 1990s. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation in Moscow with President Putin and Jiang Zemin. The 20-year treaty covered everything from economics, diplomacy, and geopolitical relations. Interestingly, Article 9 of that clause basically binds the two nations to help each other out in the case of war. It states, when a situation arises in which one of the contracting parties deems that peace is being threatened and undermined, or its security interests are involved, or when it's confronted with the threat of aggression, the contracting party shall immediately hold contacts and consultations in order to eliminate such threats. The treaty also talks about intelligence sharing, and includes a no first use clause that ensures that both parties will not use nuclear force against each other as a first response. This treaty was renewed in 2021, and it seems that the intention is for the two parties to continue to work together. Currently, it seems their allegiance is stronger than ever, and it's alleged that as a favor to China, Russia waited until after the Beijing Olympics ended February 20th to invade Ukraine 4 days later. Western intelligence reports say that senior Chinese officials knew about the invasion prior and called in the favor. We've chronicled their journey to partnership, but now we need to look at why the Sino-Russian alliance has lasted for 2 decades. Understanding their ties will help us determine how strong or weak they are, and that will show us the fault lines behind their falling out. Now, as the saying goes, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. China and Russia's bond is built on their similar feelings towards the West, specifically the US, and this is shown in their foreign policy. Talking about issues between Russia and the US would require us to pause this video and do a completely different one. After all, Russia's been constantly in competition with America for dominance economically, militarily, and in terms of global influence. Due to their well-established rivalry, most nations either align with one or the other, and the lines are drawn pretty clearly. China's always been anti-NATO, so that automatically puts it on the Russian side. This is because China believes that America's a bully and NATO's the lapdog that does all its dirty work. On that note, China holds a very strong grudge against NATO because of something that happened in 1999.
Early hours of Friday, May the 7th, 1999, NATO planes bombed the center of Belgrade and almost risked bringing China into the conflict on the side of the Serbs. 2 rockets hit the Chinese embassy. Damage to any foreign embassy would have been embarrassing enough. Hitting the Chinese building brought a diplomatic nightmare. 3 Chinese journalists were killed by the rockets. 20 more embassy staff were injured, some of them seriously.
NATO was working to fight against Serbian aggression towards Albanians, and dropped a B-2 bomber on the Chinese embassy on May 7. Dropping the bomb on the embassy was a mistake. but 3 Chinese nationals were killed and 20 were injured. China does not believe that this was a simple miscalculation and has always suspected foul play. Since then, the US has always been public enemy number 1, and China's foreign policy is very anti-American. So both Russia and China want to take America down, and they're willing to work together to weaken American power and influence. That factor brings them together. On the military front, Russia and China's patent for aggression makes them the best of friends. Outside of their intelligence sharing, they carry out joint military drills in the seas around Taiwan, working to strengthen their military ties. Furthermore, while China's complied with the request not to sell arms to Russia, China does provide them with dual goods. These are goods that could be used for civilian or military purposes, and it's obvious that China uses this loophole to sell military equipment to Russia. Building on this, over the years, China and Russia have also worked hard to build economic cooperation. In 2007, Russia exported about $5 billion worth of goods and oil to Russia, and in 2019, that number jumped to about $5.7 billion. Even when most of the West hit Russia with sanctions in 2014, China was still one of the few countries that continued to work with Russia economically. Currently, Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier, and China's overtaken Germany as Russia's largest trading partner. Their existing relationship as trade partners means that their partnership is quite solid. Where there's money to be made, there are friendships to be built as well. What strengthens their bond even more is the similarities that exist between both their ideologies. Both governments are autocratic in nature, and the power is centralized in the hands of the leader. China's a one-party state, and Putin runs a multi-party state that cracks down heavily on any opposition. Looking at their almost identical domestic policies, it's not difficult to see why they would work well together. The cherry on the top for the two parties is that the two leaders actually like each other. That may not seem to matter, but it definitely sweetens interaction. Xi described Putin as his best friend and shared an intimate meal with him in 2018, where they shared Russian pancakes and took vodka shots. For Xi's 66th birthday in 2019, Putin presented him with a cake and a giant box of ice cream, which was an incredibly sweet gesture. Most presidents do not bother meeting up unless they have to, but it's reported that the two have met up over 40 times unofficially. They actually had a long-standing tradition of meeting up for each other's birthday that was only broken by COVID and then the Ukraine war. With such good relations between the two of them, what would cause the tension? Well, let's dive into it then. As you guys know, today's geopolitical world moves very fast, and it's pretty much impossible to keep up with all the news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers world news in a quick and simple way. Every day I send out an email directly to your inbox that covers the most important world news that you can read in less than 5 minutes. Best of all, it's completely free, and you can sign up now by using the link in the comments or link in my bio. Getting back to China and Russia, it can be hard to see it, but we need to remember that not all that glitters is gold. To begin with, there are ongoing disputes about gas prices between the two nations. When most of Europe turned its back on Russia due to its aggressions, China was one of its few economic allies. The intention was for Russia to begin to push some of its oil through a new pipeline known as the Power of Siberia 2. Russia used to export about 200 billion cubic meters in its heydays, and hoped to be able to divert some of its exports to China. Unfortunately, a disagreement about the gas prices has led to a stall in the construction of the pipeline. The two nations have not been able to come to an agreement because China's price point is considerably lower than Russia expected. Due to the sanctions, Russia has lost so much money and is really trying to make up for it here. On the other hand, China knows Russia's desperate and is using that to drive a hard bargain. For now, Russia seems to be staying diplomatic, because it needs to, but it's hard to imagine that it'll forget this squeeze by their ally. If Russia could survive economically without trade in China, we're sure there would be no need for their friendship. But currently, it is a convenience that keeps these two nations joined at the hips. On top of all this, dabbling with Russia is beginning to cause some problems for China. To try and stifle Russia's efforts in Ukraine, the Biden administration has shifted to imposing sanctions on China for aiding Russia. To further squeeze China, the US has added 42 Chinese companies to its sanction list, and Biden threatens secondary sanctions if they continue to support the aggressor. In response to the pushback, Chinese banks have become stricter and are now refusing to help Russia evade sanctions. Chinese banks are refusing to process Russian payments, and this is causing friction between the two nations. Though you'd expect Russia to understand the tricky position it's placed China in, it seems that the Kremlin's disappointed and feels that its allies should help it out. Between China's irritation and Russia's entitlements, this sanction issue has the potential to push the countries further apart as they rush to protect their own interests. Now, although Putin has stated that China is in full support of its actions in Ukraine, other reports show that China may not be in favor of Putin's aggressive policy. China's fearing a looming World War III on the side of the aggressor, which could cause big problems for Beijing. An anonymous source in the Kremlin states that the current Russian leadership has a brewing conflict with the leadership of China. This week, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Russian side once again expressed concern about the reluctance of the Chinese leadership to universally assist in circumventing Western sanctions imposed on Russia. While they have seen eye to eye on most issues, it seems that China's patience for Russia is running out. Russia's destructive and intimidating foreign policy is gaining many enemies, and China may cut ties soon if it doesn't want to go down with the Kremlin. To further sour the relationship, there are reports that China has been using hackers to spy on the Russian state. Chinese hackers have targeted dozens of computers belonging to Russian state agencies and tech companies, and reports are coming out that malicious tools have been implanted. The Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky picked up on an unknown plug-Y backdoor and an updated version of cloud sorcerer malware, which was previously used to spy on Russian organizations. The spyware has previously been identified and linked to the Beijing-linked hacking group APT-31. Although there's nothing concrete to prove these allegations, the possibility that it could be true is enough to sow distrust. It would have been idealistic of any of the parties to completely trust the other, sure, but such reports only work to sow suspicion and push a wedge between the two countries. By the way, do you remember the Sino-Soviet border dispute? Although it seemed to have been resolved, it looks like there's still some unfinished business. On a map published in 2023 by Beijing, the island of Bolshoy Ururisky Island is marked entirely as Chinese territory. This is in violation of their agreement, which splits the island between the two countries, with China controlling the eastern half and Russia controlling the western half. An honest mistake? Probably not. China may have played along for this long, but it has plans to take back what it believes belongs to it. The island, known as Heijiasi Island in Chinese, may seem unimpressive, but its strategic geographical position is important for China. It sits right at the junction of the Amur and Ussuri rivers, which means it's close to Khabarovsk, Outer Manchuria. China's uncomfortable with territory so close to one of its largest cities being partially controlled by Russia. Also, Russia controls the portion of the island where the rivers converge, and this means that it has access to shipping routes, which is strategically a bonus. With all these factors considered, it's not hard to see why China would be considering overthrowing the current agreement and taking back the territories that have been allocated between China and Russia. Outside their disputes for territories along their border, Russia and China's interests in Central Asia are a cause for concern. There's currently no friction as they've not come head-to-head, but the competition between the two is underlying. Russia tends to interfere in the politics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, which have sizable ethnic Russian communities and speak the Russian language. In 2022, the Russian military helped the government of Kazakhstan suppress anti-government riots in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana. China's role in the region has been more subtle, and its focus has been on developing infrastructure in Kazakhstan to allow for two-way trade. China's focused on the region economically, and Russia's looking at it for political gain. While there's been no fighting, two superpowers with interests in one region never ends well. We also need to ask ourselves if China's going to need Russia's allyship in the foreseeable future. China's shaping up as a global economic force, and if it continues on this trajectory, there may be very little need for it to continue to play nice with Russia. China's exports have grown substantially, with $89.4 billion worth of goods being pushed to Central Asia in 2023. Russia's current military projects and the hit of the economic sanctions have drained it considerably, and this means that it's lagging behind. If we look at it, China's economy is currently 6 times the size of Russia. China surpassed Russia in nominal per capita GDP in 2020, and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, predicts that China's GDP will reach nearly $30 trillion by 2027, while Russia's GDP is predicted to be well under $2 trillion. Furthermore, according to the SIPRI report, China's military expenditure as of this year sits at $296 billion, whereas Russia's, despite the war, sits at less than half of that at $109 billion. The glaring difference between the two means that Russia and China are no longer equal partners. Economically, Russia's holding on to China for support, and this means Russia needs China more than it needs Russia. Now, I'm not trying to make it seem like China's indestructible and would be completely self-sufficient if it burned its bridges with Russia. Trade is a vital part of both countries' economies, so they'll not be letting go of each other anytime soon. What we are highlighting is that the strings that bind them together are flimsy and could easily be snipped off. If China grows strong enough and wishes to advance its interests around the area of its border with Russia, it would likely do away with the understanding it currently has. We also need to consider that China's military is modernizing, and as it grows economically, it's now in a position to better fund its expansion projects. What's more, Russia's struggles in Ukraine have hinted to us that China is not immortal. The limited capability of its armed forces and the holes in some of its strategies show us a nation that is more aggressive than it is precise. If China were to mount an attack against Russia, it could really be anyone's game. The cracks outlined are still small, and maybe the relations between the two will remain intact for some decades to come. On the other hand, there is the possibility that the cracks will deepen and sever the ties between the two nations. Currently, Sino-Russian interests align, and therefore they'll continue to coexist. However, over time, as interests change and the playing field changes, these two powers could be on opposite ends.